On the 18th of April, crowds waited outside the Chelsea Piers in New York in drizzling rain as the Carpathia docked. Amongst the crowd was a man flanked by U.S. Marshals on both sides. This man was Senator William Smith. Senator Smith handed summon papers to the surviving 4 officers, 29 crew members, as well as Mr. Ismay, Harold Cottam, and Captain Rostron. The Carpathia needed to resume her journey as soon as possible, so it was decided that the witnesses from the Carpathia, Rostron and Cottam, would be questioned on the first day of the inquiry. On 19th April, the inquiry began in the morning. Hearings were heard at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, which was owned by the Astor family. The Carpathia's voyage had to be resumed as soon as possible, so the witnesses from the Carpathia were called to testify on the first day. The first witness examined was Mr. Ismay. The surviving crew members were given new clothes as they had lost everything in the sinking, and those summoned for the inquiry moved into the Jane Hotel in New York City. First, they held a memorial service for their lost co-workers. And there's actually rumors that this place has some paranormal stuff happening to this day, though I'm personally not sure because I haven't been there myself. The rest of the crew members were put on a tender named the George Star to Pier number 60. There they boarded the Red Star Line steamer SS Lapland. On board they were given third-class cabins and served a welcome meal. But just as the Lapland was departing New York, it received a telegram to stop and wait for a boarding party, and this boarding party came and took away 5 crew members for the inquiry, making the total number of summoned crew members 34 plus the 4 officers. So the Lapland also carried the mail bags originally intended for the Titanic's return journey and departed New York on 20th April. Once the 5 crew members and the boarding party had disembarked, it was bound for Plymouth and arrived on 28th April. In Plymouth, the Board of Trade issued strict orders that no one should be allowed to communicate with the surviving crew members till their statements were taken. 3 tenders awaited the Lapland at Plymouth. One was for the ship's own passengers, one was for the mail, and one was for the survivors. And this survivors tender was known as Sir Richard Grenville. So throughout the voyage, the survivors were kept segregated from everybody else, from the crew members, from the first class, third class, everyone. And that's because they don't want anything to, spill into public. In this photo, we can see the survivors are disembarking onto the tender, Sir Richard Grenville. As the Lapland dropped anchor in Plymouth at 8 a.m., the survivors were told to stay back as the passengers disembarked and the mail was unloaded on the first 2 tenders. And to minimize interaction between the outsiders and the survivors, the Sir Richard Grenville cruised eastwards toward Breakwater in Plymouth Sound. Why? To allow the 2 tenders to dock, unload their passengers and mail, and once this was done, all the passengers had left on the train to London, the mail had been discharged and dock workers paid off, only then the tender was allowed to come to port. Now here's something you should know. While the survivors were disembarking the Lapland, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Cannon from the British Seafarers Union arrived alongside the ship in their own sailboat, and they told the crew members that the Board of Trade has forbidden us from either boarding the ship or meeting any of you guys. So Mr. Lewis said, you should demand an interview with me as soon as possible, and the survivors also agreed, and they refused to give any testimony later on until these 2 men were allowed in, because the Board of Trade had no other choice. Otherwise they wouldn't speak. So here are some photographs of the events I just mentioned. Now as they disembarked, the survivors were directed by a column of policemen to waiting rooms near the entrance to the dock, and here quarters had been provided for them. The 3rd class waiting room was converted partly into a dining room, and the 4th dormitory was for the ordinary crew members. It was converted into a dormitory for the ordinary crew members, right? And the stewards and the stewardesses had 2nd class waiting room as dining room. As soon as the party was assembled, they were given a meal, and then a few of them, most likely natives, also looked from the windows, and people were gathered all around sending messages and to them and all that. But the window was quickly closed by the authorities because once again they feared some confidential information would be leaked, and they told them, just come to the dinner quickly. So every survivor, as I mentioned, had been handed a notice under the Merchant Shipping Act, and this was that your testimony is necessary, and this happened as they were having dinner. There were preparations being made to gather their testimonies by the agents of Board of Trade, and they decided in order to save time, 6 survivors would be interviewed simultaneously by different interrogators, and once they gave their testimony, they had to sign it, and then they are just free to go out. But they had to come back to the quarters and sleep here, and this will continue till everybody's testimonies were taken, and then the plan was that they will charter a train which takes them to Southampton. In Southampton, they would be paid off by the White Star, and technically White Star's responsibility ends there. So just before they left, it was announced that a sum of £300 which had been sent from America for the crew would be distributed amongst them, and at 1:30 p.m. the first batch left. The rest left the next day. Now regarding these depositions, these testimonies, they decided which survivor was best suited for the Board of Trade's agenda in the upcoming inquiry. Because you see, this inquiry, you will soon realize, was less about looking at facts and more about some cover-up going on. So the problem is that not much of these statements survive to this day, because it's generally believed that they were either locked away in some archives or just disposed of once the inquiry was over. But some newspapers mentioned sections of these statements, and that's like the only time public read some parts of them, because the whole statements were never made public, and some survivors kept a copy of their statements as well, like Harold Lowe. So you can still see it, his family has it. But the bulk is lost, and if there is anything, worth being called Titanic's Holy Grail, it's no doubt these statements. On 29th April, the 34 surviving crew members of the Titanic were cleared by Senator Smith to leave the US. They departed the same evening on the RMS Celtic, arriving in Liverpool on 4th of May. On the 2nd of May, Mr. Ismay and the 4 surviving officers were also cleared to leave. They departed the same day on RMS Adriatic, stopping at Queenstown and then arriving in Liverpool on Saturday, the 11th of May. The inquiry in the US lasted till 25th of May. On 28th, the final report was presented to the Senate. The report praised Rostron, criticized the crew of California, and declared the disaster an act of God, clearing both Mr. Ismay and the White Star Line. Now this is a political purpose, because it wasn't exactly an act of God. People's incompetence definitely had a role in it. But most importantly, they gave recommendations for maritime safety. And the most important of these were like this. For example, ships should now slow down in ice fields. They should now have a radio which should be kept on and attended 24/7. There should be lifeboats for everyone. All ships should now have bulkheads extended to the top of hull and double hull. Now ships should not fire rockets at sea unless they are in disaster, and rockets of any color fired at any interval now means disaster and nothing else. Before, there was a particular color and 1 minute interval. Otherwise, they could have other meanings as well. International Ice Patrol was established in 1913 to map detailed maps of the ice fields and share this info with the ships. And all crew members should now take part in the lifeboat drills, so they are skilled in launching them. This later became known as the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, also known as SOLAS, and it's still followed to this day. However, the inquiry also received criticisms. Senator Smith had zero experience with sailing, and he often asked basic questions multiple times to different witnesses. And this made him a joke in Britain. For example, he asked Officer Lowe, "What is an iceberg composed of?" Lowe replied, "Ice, I suppose." Though in reality it is made of ice, slate, dead fish, and whatever comes in its way, just in case you don't know. He did not understand what the watertight compartments were in the first place, and he asked the witness, why didn't the passengers and crew take refuge inside the watertight compartments? And this gave him the nickname Watertight Smith in Britain. And he also had to be explained that going down by the head and sinking by the bow meant the exact same thing, and that an officer was a sailor, but a sailor was not an officer. But either way, the British inquiry was supposed to be a much greater joke. This inquiry was held by the Rec Commissioner on behalf of the Board of Trade. Lightoller writes that in the American inquiry they were questioned by amateurs, but in Britain it was professionals. Lord Mersey, the president of the inquiry, was himself a former seafarer, and his son was a ship captain as well. And this inquiry had around 100 witnesses, including those not questioned earlier in the US inquiry, as it was much more rushed, like Stanley Adams, the operator on the SS Masuba, Captain James Barr of the RMS Caronia. But interestingly, only 2 passengers were questioned, and these passengers were Mr. Ismay and Sir Cosmodolph Gordon, both scandalous first-class survivors. The inquiry, as I mentioned, received a lot of criticism as a whitewash and cover-up attempt. Lightoller in his memoirs wrote, the memoirs are known as Titanic and the Other Ships. In Washington, it was of little consequence, but in London, it was very necessary to keep one's hand on the whitewash brush. Sharp questions that needed careful answers if one was to avoid a pitfall. How hard the lawyers tried to prove that there were not enough seamen to launch and man the boats, and quite truly. But it was inadvisable to admit it then, and hence the hard-fought legal duels between us. A washing of dirty linen would help no one. The Board of Trade had passed the ship as in all aspects fit for sea in every sense of the word. Now the Board of Trade was holding an inquiry into the loss of that ship, hence the whitewash brush. Personally, I had no desire that blame would be attributed either to the Board of Trade or the White Star Line, though in all conscience it was a difficult task, when one had known full well and for many years the ever-present possibility of such a disaster. I think in the end the Board of Trade and the White Star Line won. The whole point of the inquiry was face-saving, basically. The British Board of Trade's rules were outdated and were directly responsible for the disaster, and this was a fact they wanted to twist and cover up. The inquiry lasted till 3rd of July, and the final report was published on 30th of July. Findings and recommendations were very similar to that of the American inquiry. Titanic historian Donald Lynch writes, apart from protecting itself, the Board of Trade had no interest in seeing the White Star Line found negligent. Any damage to the White Star's reputation or balance sheet would be bad for the British shipping, and there was a considerable potential for both. Negligence on part of the shipping company might pave the way for millions of dollars in damage claims and lawsuits that would tie up the courts for years, possibly break the White Star Line and result in loss of much of Britain's lucrative shipping traffic to the Germans and the French. So to conclude from all this, you see, in conclusion, we can say that while the British inquiry had more professionals, it was all about covering up the Board of Trade's mistake and saving their reputation. While the American inquiry, although led by amateurs, was much more progressive when it came to pointing out errors and suggesting new measures. The American inquiry emphasized more that the disaster was caused all by the Board of Trade's outdated rules, which were made with advice from ship owners, and that the negligent behavior of the captain, while the British inquiry emphasized more on saying nothing can change the past, our inquiry is to ensure the same thing doesn't happen again.